So welcome to this webinar, which is about using PeakVisor for geolocation. For people who were here yesterday on driving PeakVisor, that was much more about how the tool itself works. Today is about not so much driving it as how to plan your routes and navigate if you were in a car. So starting off, this is the Bellingcat online toolkit, and there is a link which we'll put in the chat to where you can find that. I'm sure many of you are already aware of it and using it, but it's a very useful thing. It's also not totally up to date. So this is the entry for PeakVisor, and it's listed as a mountain identification tool. And I'm hoping that by the end of today, you're very convinced that it's a little bit more than that. There is an entry here for article in the website which uses PeakVisor. There are many more now, so this definitely needs to be updated to say that PeakVisor is increasingly appearing in write-ups of geolocations. Okay, would the person who's used it for geolocation just like to unmute and say what they've used it for? It'll be interesting to hear. Say who you are, and then just as far as you wish to. And then tell us a little bit about what you did. That would be interesting.
I just used it to look at imagery of mountains in the area in the Middle East. Well, there was little else to look at, but there are some specific peaks in the area. So I used PeakVisor to look for matching peaks in a general location.
Hello, Gabor. Nice to see you.
So, yeah.
You're famous on the slides a little bit later on. We're going to talk about some of your work. So anyone else want to tell us? The two missing are actually the panelists, aren't they? So we'll end that poll. Thanks for that. So PeakVisor is moving on almost too quickly. I've been using it for about a year, and in that time, it's changed enormously, partly because I've tried to change it because the people who developed it sent out a poll and asked what I was using PeakVisor for. And what they expected was for me to say, I've climbed the Matterhorn and here's a picture of me in a bobble hat. And what I said was I'm using it for geolocation. And they wrote back and said, what's that? And being techies, they were interested. So the conversation led to the POPSI project, which is the developers of PeakVisor being interested enough to put their time in for free to develop a special version for us, for the open source community. And that's something quite special. It also means that PeakVisor is a work in progress, which, as we saw yesterday, means that PeakVisor is regularly tested in live and is a very exciting tool to use in terms of its stability. But that also makes it something that is improving all the time. So maybe we take a little bit of the testing upon ourselves as open source researchers because PeakVisor is developing for us. So yesterday, just to recap what we concluded, PeakVisor is complicated enough that it can actually deliver what Eric Toller very depressingly labeled bad research, bad open source research, that there is such a thing. And I guess that's something that's not well proven, that makes assumptions that can't be justified, that uses the tool in a way that's incorrect. So that's scary. I don't ever want to do bad research, but I know that I'm going to have to practice and try with good tools to crack difficult geolocations. So PeakVisor comes with a caution. It's complicated enough, as we'll see by the end of today, that you can make mistakes with it and get things wrong. It's true of almost any tool, but PeakVisor allows you to hack in to the URL and change things at quite a basic level. So we all know it's very quick and convenient to work like that, but it's also a little bit dangerous. It's like fiddling about in the registry in Windows. It's just worrying. You need experience to Photofit well. Photofit is the thing that everybody usually knows about PeakVisor, that you can superimpose this silhouette from the rendered image over your photograph. And Google can't really match that. You can do an overlay, but you can't change the field of view, the focus level. So that's something that is a real unique selling point for PeakVisor, not that we're paying for it. And it's great, but you do need to practice. It's not going to be something that you do brilliantly first time. So these are all, the orange ones are the bad side or the difficult side or the daunting side. You're also going to experience firsthand that PeakVisor is demanding on machine and bandwidth. And we saw that yesterday. Some people experienced slow performance, others not so much. And that pre-release testing is limited, naturally. It's probably down to us a little bit. So all sorts of exciting things happened with PeakVisor, and they did overnight, where we lost a tiny bit of functionality in certain browsers. So it's a work in progress. But to compensate for all that, PeakVisor is capable of stunning accuracy in terms of geolocation. Its data set alone is valuable when we start to examine what they've done with their data. The dual view interface, where you can see where you are from above and what the view looks like in a 3D panorama around you, is a very simple idea. In terms of day-to-day working, it's amazingly powerful. And their terrain rendering is extremely authentic, not just because of the data, but because of the things they do to actually shade their terrain and deal with shadows. So pros and cons, like most things. So it's always upgrading. It's a useful tool, but more than anything, it's developing for us. And it's one of the few tools where we have much of a voice about the functionality it has. So we have about 5 crucial features that we think are the reason that PeakVisor is worth doing. Because as we said yesterday, there is a big investment in your time to learn any number of those tools from the Bellingcat toolbox. It changes, where do we put our time? It has to be worth it. So PeakVisor is very accurate. It doesn't try to put band-aids or elastoplast over the data it's got. It may try to shade it very well, but what it doesn't do is what we saw yesterday happened within Google. Google Earth, this is Mount Rushmore. If you examine very low down in certain modes of view in Google Earth, you will see that really Mount Rushmore looks fantastic because it's got the faces. Poor old PeakVisor hasn't got any faces. That's because both of them are based on very often LiDAR data, which is about 30-meter accuracy. You won't pick out the faces at that accuracy. So what Google's done is stick some information over the top, which looks great from several images, but not every single view. So this Monty Python looking view is something you can genuinely find in Google. It's not wrong in the sense that they're aiming at their own users, and their own users are more interested in the immersive experience of what it's like to be at Mount Rushmore than they are in complete topological accuracy. So these are pointing at different people, and the same data is being used in different ways. And Google is probably not totally focused on open source, whereas PeakVisor is. Let's take a little look at PeakVisor's data sources. This is what they say themselves. I've put their own words in there. I'm not going to do this a lot because it's a lot of busy text, but they are telling you where they're getting their information. And it turns out that really they're getting information from very modern sources, but they also get it from quite old sources. If, say, the old Soviet era maps are being sold off and they add information that isn't available from the satellite imagery. So the art of this is to have tiles of data that you then sew together in sensible ways that don't produce strange performance when it comes to the joins. Here is a sample of the Matterhorn, one of the finest mountains in the world. And here are the coordinates of the Matterhorn down here. Just check out that model, see what you think. Go to PeakVisor at peakvisor.com, put those coordinates in, and then there's a few questions about finding the largest body of water you can see from the top of the Matterhorn and measuring distances. So I'll come along and do it with you later, but just have a little go at that to check out that model. We're going to be looking for a lake, which is within the line of sight of the summit. You don't, by the way, have to use those coordinates because the Matterhorn is in PeakVisor's database of mountains, which is what Gabor was using it for, I guess, just like to look up these mountains. But when you're trying to go somewhere that's not a mountain in the database, you will have to put the location in. Okay, so quick recap of what PeakVisor allows us to see. On this side, we've got the 2D window, like looking down on the map. We can zoom in and out. We can see little contour lines, which is extremely useful. And if we want to, we can fill, if we want some detail, we can fill the whole screen with it. We wish it wouldn't resize, but it does. So we have to zoom back in and look again. So that's one view. And if we wanted to move, which we don't for this exercise, we would pick up that map pin, which is our position, and drag and drop it, chuck it somewhere else. It would be one way of moving large distances. You would see PeakVisor strain to re-render that, but it wouldn't be very accurate about where you want to go. So there are plenty of ways of traveling. This window is the 3D rendered view. And unless you are going to climb the Matterhorn yourself, this is probably one of the few times when we'll know exactly what it looks like to stand up there, triumphant, and scan round. Notice, by the way, that because PeakVisor knows where the Matterhorn is, in this URL bar that shows all of the different parameters of our view, it's not showing the Matterhorn's latitude and longitude. But if I go in here, they're filled in under this little search menu. If you have coordinates, you can either stick them in here, or you could stick them in here, whatever you want to do. But this one, it knows it's the Matterhorn, so it's got no problem, but it doesn't tell us where it is. It just goes straight there. So this view can be, what I'm actually doing here is changing the field of view. I'm using the mouse scroll wheel to do that. And what it's doing, in fact, I'm not moving. It is including more or less of the 360-degree view in this little screen window we're using. It's the equivalent of standing in the same place on top of the Matterhorn, getting your telescope out and twizzling the focus. So remember, when you see that, you're not moving. If you were in Google and you use the scroll wheel, in ground level view, it's moving. Your latitude and longitude will change. But here, that's not what's happening. You're absolutely in the same place. You're just changing the focus. So we need to find this large body of water visible from the Matterhorn summit. And I will tell you my shame when I was presenting some of these ideas to the tech team, that I was looking at this and thinking, oh, they're all nice lakes. We ought to be able to see lots of lakes. And of course, it was pointed out to me gently by somebody very bright that they have contour lines. Lakes do not have height. They are glaciers. So that's me told. But there are some bodies of water. So if we were just scanning around quite quickly, I think we would pick out that might be a body of water, but it's a bit pale. I'm keeping the horizon in view. The Matterhorn's a wonderful thing for PeakVisor because it's such an irregular shape. Whichever way you go, you're going to come across these. They look like lakes. I think they actually call them coals, I'm not sure. So the hint is take the biggest one, and it's next to the 2658 peak, which is there. So I want to get that in the middle of my view and say, what's my compass bearing? Well, this picture is always done with north at the top. So we know it's quite close to pointing south. But if we want to be exact, then there's two ways of checking that. One is we've got a compass here, a lovely little compass. We needn't change the color of it. And right in the middle of it, it shows us 175 degrees. So well done, the people who worked out 175 degrees. Remember, of course, that you can do 360 minus a reading is another way that sometimes these negative values are shown on a compass. So that looks like our little lake that we're looking for. And what distance is it from the Matterhorn summit? Well, I don't know whether you know that, because it's not that well publicized. If you were on the PeakVisor for OSINT Twitter X feed, you would see some little videos coming out that tell you about new functionality. But the functionality to measure a distance is to press Shift and then left mouse click. And lo and behold, in this map, you can see we've hit the correct lake. It's right next to Pill.me at 2658, and it's told us it's 5.3 kilometers. More excitingly, down here, we get all this information about the point that we've picked out, its elevation, its distance. We could even teleport to it if we wanted to. So PeakVisor has allowed us to master one of the very difficult things about imagery, which is the depth of it. How far away are these things? If we've got something that gives us context, like a person or a tree or a sheep, if you're where I live, you have a lot of sheep and you can tell how far away the mountains are. But here, we don't have that much to go by. It's very difficult to work out. But PeakVisor immediately gives us the depth and says that's 5 kilometers away. And you can get some sort of context about the whole thing. It's always sensible to close these down when you've done them. It keeps PeakVisor's interface happy. So that's just a first look. Oh, look, that one's a long way away. 35 kilometers away. There's no way of knowing. PeakVisor's done the work for you by going away and getting that information. And we've got quite a quick idea that these things that the people are very proud of, like their Matterhorn model, yes, you know, they do have a good deal of detail, and they are, we'll see later, pretty realistic if you compare them with, say, a photograph. So this is what else they're saying about their data, which is quite exciting for any of us who may want to use it in other ways outside of PeakVisor. They're telling us that they've done a lot of work on the data in the background. They haven't just taken satellite data and that's it. They have cross-checked all of these different data sources, and that's what makes the joins work between all of these different tiles of information. And they're saying, a proud boast, we have higher quality data in a unified format for the whole world. Well, that's a great thing to say. Presumably, if that's true, we'll be able to see that in the performance of their rendering tools. So they've also, it's quite a big deal at the moment. There is an API that just allows you to plant a PeakVisor view into a web page. But there's also an accepted request to create an API which will allow access to the elevation data for a given area. And that's now actually accepted, and it's in progress. So that's quite exciting. But what these people have really done is to say that they're making their terrain data open source. And given that they've put a lot of work into it, that's an interesting strategic decision to make as a company. We've put all this work into making our data better, and now we're going to give it away. And it's interesting how that will play out. So these are some of the data blocks that we will be given access to. There's cloudless seasonal satellite imagery. These guys concentrate very hard on the different looks throughout the seasons, and they spend a lot of time getting the best views from satellite imagery. The digital elevation model is the name of the game because that's the actual level of detail we can get in terms of something like a unicorn horn on the top of Everest. Will it or won't it show? But look, I think someone asked this yesterday, they actually offer, this is their words, not mine. If you see something you need, let us know. So they're interested in improving their data in areas they think people are interested. Now, that's what Google did. They thought people were interested in Mount Rushmore. They're right. So they went and got more data and stuck it over the top, not particularly topologically accurately, but in a way that gave people an immersive experience. PeakVisor are interested in doing something which gives you higher resolution data, but I think that they're going to focus on topological accuracy. So that's good for us. I'm not sure that the parameters to do with mountaineering are always going to be top notch for us as open source investigators. They could be, but the location refinement is a very interesting thing. All the tools try to do some form of interpolation, try to put shading and try to do something that improves the experience of looking at this data when it's rendered. And it's an interesting point because Google does something to its data, it uses a process. And what it actually does is smooth it. So some very craggy looking mountain comes out looking like not a bowling ball, but quite polished. And that's great in terms of performance because it means that we can slide around inside the 3D Google universe. No problem. It's a nice feeling. Unfortunately, we're unlikely to recognize any jagged features because they've been polished off. PeakVisor, by contrast, is quite a clunky, looks like Star Trek warp drive interface when we try to move. So it's not very smooth, but it is very accurate. So horses for courses about the way this data's treated, and never trust a view as being what God sees, because it's not. It's all somebody else's rendering of a certain data set. So we saw what that really delivered. I had to rip this slide apart yesterday because it wouldn't work. So let's hope it behaves itself today. But this is a photograph, an open source piece of imagery, and Google's rendering of it. It's the same place. This is from the article, you'll recognize it. I've highlighted a few of the features that make it identifiable. It is, of course, a very sad occasion. It's a burial of more than one person, and they're likely to have died violently because they are being buried very shortly after civil unrest in Tajikistan. So this is an unhappy scene. We wish to geolocate it so that we can confirm that this is actually what was said on social media. So Google's had a go, but you can see how smooth it is. Most of the distinctive things here are this teapot lid looking thing at the top. That's very distinctive. It's been polished. This really unusual looking snaggletooth rock. Also, this slope is quite distinctive. But those are the things that make it so distinctive, and Google's lost them. So this is the PeakVisor one. PeakVisor genuinely rendered that. You can see how they've colored it in. They've got all this detail. So it makes me think this isn't because PeakVisor's got necessarily higher resolution imagery every time it looks better and more like the photograph. It's also that Google, in order to be able to move around in that 3D world, has polished what they've got. So it's purely the way the data's been treated in some cases. So PeakVisor then allows you to see exactly where that is on the map. I added this arrow, but of course it gives you the location in the 2D map. So we've very quickly gone, oh yes, wow, yeah, I do. Yeah, that looks very similar. Where am I? and it tells you straight away. And it's solving the general geolocation problem of the fact that you're looking downwards on a map and you're looking sideways when you're taking a photograph of the world. Not true for satellites and drones, but as a general rule, you need this intermediate 3D rendering. I've pictured it as a mesh to make the change of 90 degrees between your orientation looking at the map and your orientation for most of the things that you're going to see as open source imagery. So that really was some sort of evidence that what they say about their data has an impact in practice. Now, don't worry about this being a huge table. It's probably changing all the time, but it's here to say that maybe we should use these tools together, and that Google's great about covering terrain in real time. It has something that PeakVisor doesn't at all, which is the whole backlog history of views over time. So you know that you can go back over a range of dates and see how the terrain has changed. That's invaluable. You're always going to need that. There's no way that Google Suite isn't still an absolute touchstone for this kind of research. PeakVisor is something that just you use in conjunction with it. So when you first find out about a place, you want to go check it out, obviously go to Google, but don't necessarily go to it for true locations of photographs. And it's not very easy when you're looking at those little bubble photos inside Google imagery to know what the aspect of the photo was. There's no nice little arrow saying I was pointing this way when I took the photo. So that is something that I always feel I desperately wish was in there, but of course Google can't tell the photographers to do that. So PeakVisor generally said it doesn't represent cityscapes. It's not focused on photography. It's much slower to switch viewpoint. You'll certainly see it switching viewpoint, but it is strong on an orientation. And it's very clear on the parameters behind the view you're looking at. You can hack into them yourself. It's strong on distance measurement and, of course, photo fitting. And it allows you to change field of view or focus, which PeakVisor can't. I'm just looking at a Q&A. These distances are flying distances by air, not ground. Yes, they are. And Google gives you the option, as I'm sure you know, you probably wouldn't be asking this question. It allows you to say, do you want to do the distance along the ground or do you want to do it through the air? And that's fantastically useful for something like, there's another geolocation in Tajikistan where we're trying to work things out about a helicopter and where it's firing. So yes, you're quite right. So use both tools, exploit the differences. So I thought it would be interesting to take a look at exactly what these two tools show and hide. There's a few locations here we can visit them both in PeakVisor and in Google and see what the differences are. So the Tower of London is a particularly interesting one. I've prepared the coordinates as well. Most of them will show in database terminology. Others, you need to put in the coordinates. I've got all the coordinates ready for you. But if we compare what we're seeing in PeakVisor, particularly in the city in London, we can maybe get a clue as to what it's actually doing with its data. So we've chosen lots of different places where there are man-made structures, which is not what PeakVisor excels at. The slag heaps in Azov-style steelworks, where the terrible siege took place, the Hoover Dam, everybody knows what that looks like, Tower of London, slap bang in the city, and Mount Rushmore, just because we already did it. So here's PeakVisor in the middle of London, and it doesn't look like London. It is telling us about the lie of the land, which can be amazingly interesting. but it's also telling us some other stuff. So, for example, we know that the middle of London isn't full of these funny little high hills. So given that we know this is LiDAR data for a lot of the data sets, what do you think we're looking at when we see something like this 544 meter hill? What's it most likely to be? Feel free to just shout out what you think it is. Is it a mistake? Is it an error? Why are we seeing these funny little hippo hills in the middle of London?
Is it an
Hello?
Yeah, you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. It's a little bit faint.
Oh, okay. I said it's maybe an interpretation of buildings.
Yes. And I think the thing is, it has to be buildings which are of sufficient size and height, particularly width, to appear. They have to be around that 30-meter grid size, I think, width-wise, to show. But when you look at something that's just across the docks in the background, 544 meters away, it's probably, here we go, Tower of London, just across the docks, 544 meters away. It's going to be something like one of these two. And when you look, you think, okay, yes, it's because not they're particularly tall buildings. A tall, thin skyscraper probably won't show, but these buildings probably will. So it's probably Thomas More Square, this big one here or one here, but they have to have some heft to them. They have to show on the LiDAR data. And that's why it looks like this. So the only use to you would be if you are looking at bits of London where you know where the buildings are and you want to know the lie of the land. But I think you're absolutely right. PeakVisor, this is not its environment. It would be a very strange kind of geolocation if this was what you wanted to use PeakVisor for. As of stars, a little different because these are man-made features. And therefore, it's interesting that they do show. They have been picked up. It was very useful indeed to be able to measure these and use them when we were trying to geolocate certain imagery. This is not a hugely mountainous region, but it was very useful to do the actual technical distances to work out what we were looking at, because one slag heap looks surprisingly like another. And in Google Earth, that's particularly true. So the Google Earth view is a bit more confusing in terms of looking at what you're seeing. If we went sideways on that, we would see that actually there are lots and lots of photos, but there aren't loads of ways of telling exactly what you're looking at. So the photos I found when searching this area weren't all that helpful. In fact, they were misleading, whereas being able to just compass my way around it was. So buildings don't help, but man-made structures like this, it was actually quite valuable. The Hoover Dam, I think, is actually remarkably similar. I was surprised how well PeakVisor did the Hoover Dam. Quite some features. If you're wondering why it's dark, we can change the time and we can therefore actually switch the lights on, so to speak. So I think the Hoover Dam was quite close. If you're wanting to look at exact locations and distances, then I think that's quite a feasible use of PeakVisor versus Google Earth. And of course, the really odd one is Mount Rushmore, because Mount Rushmore in Google almost has too much information. In Google, Mount Rushmore is so overloaded with information that it starts to make the mistakes that we saw, not mistakes, but if you start trying to measure around that Monty Python type imagery that we had earlier, the one where it seems to be up in the sky. Let me see if I can find it again. That's a very strange thing to try to deal with. So the photographs at this point are actually, I think, more of a hindrance than anything else. So if we go back to that one, that's a place actually, I can't trust any distances measured around here. That's a place that if I'm just trying to recognize it, sure, I'll go straight there. But if I'm trying to work out, say, my position relative to a photograph, I'm probably going to be using PeakVisor for that. So it's interesting to see what PeakVisor actually does when it doesn't have just landscapes. And it makes a stab at things, but obviously you can see that in cities, no surprise, that's not going to happen. So we really have a situation where we're going to use PeakVisor and Google interchangeably, except when we're in the cities. But another tool that PeakVisor works alongside that's also now getting built into PeakVisor is Suncalc. And I think most of you will have come across Suncalc in some form because it allows us to use information in an image, which is either the position of the sun, but more likely it's going to be the position of shadows. PeakVisor now mimics what Suncalc can deliver, which is the relationship between the date and time, the position on the surface of the Earth, and the position of the sun and moon. And it's one of those situations where if you have all but one of those, you can calculate the other. So if you know everything except about the sun and the date and time, except where you are, you can geolocate yourself from that information. If you know everything except the time, you can chronolocate the image. It's an approximate thing, but it can be very valuable to cut down search time using the sort of let's eliminate where we know we couldn't feasibly be. So if you find out that actually at the place you imagine, it would be dark at the time the photo was taken, or the sun would be in a different position, or the shadows would be facing a different way, you can eliminate whole swathes of search area. And although it looks very impressive to chronolocate an image, actually elimination of impossible locations is probably one of the things that it's most used for. So Suncalc gives you a separate interface, whereas PeakVisor draws sun and moon trails in the sky. So just recapping what we're actually looking at is the fact that the sun is moving above us along a trail that is fixed by our location, date and time, and it will very kindly cast a shadow for us, which may show on our images. There are a couple of really good articles about this, which we can stick links in the chat for you about, written, I think they're actually on the website, the Bellingcat website, written by Yuri and Nick, which give you some very good examples. There is even a shadow method, which Nick demonstrates, where if you can relate, if the object that's casting the shadow and the shadow are in the same image, then you can work out the angle of elevation of the sun. But I have to say, trying that in practice, you need those two to be at right angles to you. So I've had a go at that. I wasn't massively accurate, but I think Nick is the master of it. The two angles that define the position of the sun are the azimuth angle, which is its compass bearing. And that's equivalent to the yaw value, the compass value in PeakVisor, provided you're pointing at the sun. So that's handy. And the other value is the elevation of the sun. How high is it in the sky? And that corresponds to the pitch value in PeakVisor, which you'll see in the URL. So how high up is the sun in the sky? That's the elevation or altitude. And our little man has come out for a tan again. So this is Suncalc, and we're going to compare the functionality in Suncalc and PeakVisor to understand, firstly, how you do this, whatever tool you're using, and secondly, how to do it in Suncalc, how to do it in PeakVisor. PeakVisor is very handy because everything's in the same tool. So if you're already looking at an area, then you don't have to yank its coordinates out, stick it in Suncalc. But if I was seriously doing something where I was doing a chronolocation, I would definitely use both tools just to check. So far, they have always checked out. So Suncalc, you put in where you are. It obviously has a database as well, but you set it down here, latitude and longitude. You put in the date, which is quite hard to make it stick. It comes up with all of this information, and you can pull the slider back and forth to change the time. This big pink thing is not often there. It's because of an eclipse. Now here's me sliding in part of the PeakVisor interface just to compare them. So everything inside this blue square is actually PeakVisor. They're only put over one another just so that we can compare what's going on. So when you're doing one of these, you need, first of all, to put in the location. So the location here is set latitude and longitude down in the geodata on Suncalc. You can put it in up here or there in PeakVisor. PeakVisor displays its heart on its sleeve. It puts all the values that define this particular view into the URL, and you can hack it and change it up there. You can easily make a mistake, but it's very quick. So as you start to use PeakVisor more frequently, you'll probably just use the URL values most. What you need to be doing is to be pointing at the sun in its sun trail. And for that, you need crosswires. Last night, one of the interesting things that got changed in PeakVisor, because it's such an exciting work in progress, is that we don't actually have crosswires. We have a crosswire as of about 10 o'clock last night. So you're going to have to bear with me and imagine that you have proper crosswires, because they'll be restored probably over the weekend. But for now, it's all a bit too exciting. So you can also see the other information. You will be looking at the altitude, which is the pitch up here, same value. You will be looking at the azimuth angle, which is the one in the compass, also called yaw. And when you're trying to get a perfect time chronolocation, you pull this little sun up and down. And when you're trying to do it in PeakVisor, you move this little lever instead. So the crosswires are the thing that would be tremendously useful where we've only got one of them. They're also useful for pointing at peaks, looking at horizons, which we'll do a bit later, and pointing at the sun. And Shift P will generally produce that. Now, at the moment, it only seems to be working in Edge as a browser. So I don't know what browsers you're using. You may just have to approximate, and forgive me, that the crosswires aren't working. If they are, you can recolor them with Shift-C, and just for the hell of it, tell you that the labels toggle on and off with Shift-L. We have a whole sheet of these, which we discover whenever the developers feel like telling us, and we are going to put it in the chat later. It's also on the Twitter feed. So we'll start with this image, which is another of the Tajikistan burial images. This one is not a composite image taken from a video. This is a still image. We've pixelated the bodies out of respect for the fact that this is actually a burial. And we are working to do this exercise on the assumption that we know what the location is. So we might have got a very good photo fit here. In fact, there is a good photo fit here. And the exercise is, because we're practicing sun and moon trails, given that we know where we are, and we're estimating a date just after the date of this civil unrest, when the military came to this area, and there are numerous reports of people being killed, but also the government freely admits that people were killed. So given that this is a Muslim area and that these are Ismaili Muslims, then this is likely to have taken place very, very shortly after these events. So we're looking at 19th of May. And what we want to do is use Suncalc and PeakVisor and check out that those results compare. Now, if you're only working on putting the sun in the middle of your screen, then it's going to be a little less accurate, but we really want to have the confidence to know that these two things are going to come out with approximately the same answer. We need the azimuth angle of the sun, the compass bearing of the sun from north. That's the thing that we need to put into either of those systems to come out with a time. So I'm going to work with you to get the azimuth angle, just in case it's not obvious to you how to do it. And then I'm going to leave you to do the Suncalc and PeakVisor calculations. So if you're looking at this, what's missing for you? You can see this nice shadow. We don't have the thing that casts the shadow, which I imagine is one of the mourners. We don't have them in the picture, but we do have a very good shadow. What we need is a compass bearing. Now, how can we get that? If we had exactly a photosphere in Google Earth that could show us this, it still doesn't come with orientation. Google doesn't do that. But this is a remote part of Tajikistan. There is nothing there in terms of much Google imagery at this particular place. So how could we possibly work out where we are in terms of orientation? Anybody got any ideas? Do by all means speak. Thank you.
I guess looking at the picture, we can use PeakVisor to see what direction the picture is taken in.
I think PeakVisor can do that. Yes, thank you for that. By using a reference point. So what PeakVisor can do that we couldn't do very easily otherwise is that this reference point, which isn't a named mountain or anything else, but it's very distinctive. As long as we've got something distinctive, then we can use PeakVisor to actually help us geolocate with that. So the clue is that if we've got a distinctive landmark in the 3D view, you don't have to have it in the 2D view, and from above, you won't be able to see it. But if there's something in the 3D view that you can recognize in the photo, point at it. PeakVisor will draw you that line. You can get the orientation of that line. You can use it as an effective north and just correct for it later. So we're quite lucky here in this example. Look, the bearing is -5. It almost gave us a pointing north. Not quite, but it's not far off. So that's a handy thing to have. And it means that we're still in the business. We can still move forward with this. Now, I did something to try to improve accuracy. Geolocation is never that accurate. Chronolocation, sorry, is never that accurate. But I've just angled my protractor in a 3D view so that I get a slightly better compass reading. Whenever we're doing anything in geolocation, we should really think about the accuracy or the tolerance of the results, the statements that we're making. Do we think this is accurate to 2%, to 50%? 50% is no use to anyone. What do we imagine? So chronolocation is one of the least accurate things. So we can't see north in this image, but we can see that lovely snaggletooth rock, which has helped me so much in life in doing Tajikistan work. It doesn't have a name, it's just distinctive. That's all it needs to be. So if we're pointing up there, we now know that's at -5 degrees from north. And we can correct anything. If we use this as our North Pole, we can correct it by 5 degrees afterwards. So we've effectively got a baseline. That's our shadow. Straight line through the shadow, and it crosses our reference line. And we can try to get a reasonably accurate measurement. Here comes my angled protractor for me to do that measurement. Finding a transparent protractor was one of the joys of my life when I first started geolocation. Here it is. This one isn't transparent, doesn't need to be, at about, let's call it 97. So we now have an azimuth angle. Because we can calculate it, this one is, the turquoise line is our baseline in the photo. It's the one that points at the snaggletooth rock. This is just a bit of trigonometry. It's 5 degrees, -5 degrees from north. The angle between the shadow and our reference line is here at 97. And we can correct that by the 5 degrees and then think, if I'm doing a measurement of azimuth, the sun is coming all the way around here and shining from over there. So the correction comes at either 258 degrees azimuth angle round, or you can call it -102, depending on which way you're doing it. You just subtract it from 360. So now we're ready to go. Now we have the location, we know that, the date, and we have the azimuth angle. And you have a go with both tools. I'm worried that you won't actually be able to use crosswires. So you're going to have to use the center of the screen unless you can see. If you do shifted P and anything appears, that's great. If I do it, I just get one line at the moment. So I'll be able to demo it for you, but not very well. By the way, everyone, when you get to, don't stop what you're doing now, but when you get to doing anything with PeakVisor, if you do shift and lowercase p in the 3D window, let me know if you get crosswires or not. Maybe nothing happens, maybe you get little crosswires. The crosswires you can actually see here on this image. They're underneath the little map pin. You can see some very fine white crosswires. So just let me know if you can, whether you see crosswires or not when you do Shift P in the PeakVisor 3D window. So if you don't have the crosswires, you just have to estimate where the center of the screen is. It's not impossible, it's just going to be less accurate. The crosswires are only there to show you exactly where the pinpoint center of the screen is. My main error when I do these is to forget that the sun's 180 degrees behind the shadow, which is dumb, I know, but I've done it a lot. And that's the thing that I kept getting wrong. The fact that when you get into Suncalc, you actually see the sun on the map is helpful. Okay, I'll keep going. So Suncalc, been around for years, lots and lots of extra features, very, very well tested, very well practiced. So first of all, we've put in our location. It's moved where we want it to move. Very good rendition. And we now want to change the date. In both tools, making the date behave itself and making the system accept the date was quite difficult. It would often just suddenly recorrect to today for no reason. So 19th of May, 2022. And of course, the sun paths were different. And both these tools know that and know where to get the information from. So here we are, we're casting a shadow. The mountain is up here. We know from the image we were looking uphill and the sun was coming from our left, wasn't it? And we want to find an azimuth angle, here's azimuth angle, of 258 or minus 102, depending where we are. So if I do this, we can watch a day happen. It even colors it in, it's beautiful. So we're going through dawn, there's a bit of light, but you can't see the sun. Sunrise, you actually, look, switches on, love that bit. Culmination, when it's absolutely as high overhead as it's going, is apparently there. And then we're trying for an azimuth angle of 258. So I'm just moving this. I'm getting the azimuth angle to go in the direction I want it to. And now I'm trying to stop at 258 and I'll read off the time. 15:11 is the time that we're given. Does that seem feasible? It's not dark in the photo, so that's a good start. That seems quite feasible. I can imagine you remember the angle of the sun and the shadow in that photo. If we're looking uphill this way, that makes a lot of sense. So just common sense check says, yeah, that's fairly reasonable. So 15:11, I think, is where we're going with that. Okay, what about PeakVisor? So I'm going to try that with good old Edge. So we need to set the location. Yes, that's correct. Now we need to set the date. So this is fiddly. You should just be able to write it in. In practice, it didn't work for me that way. I was far better to go gently with this little calendar than I was to try to write the date in. And that actually was true from Suncalc as well, oddly enough. So May 19th. Great, we're in the right place. So this is going to look a little bit different from the Suncalc side of things because our sun trail is in the sky. So if I'm lucky, I'll be able to get some sort of cross wires with shifted P. I've got cross wire. There it is. So you have to imagine something coming vertically as well. And I'm probably going to try to recolor that with shifted C so it goes red. So I'm hoping. Now, I'm flailing around looking for the sun. I found it. And I've hit this sun trail. And I'm now looking for my compass value to be either 258 or minus 102. So I need to move and keep this sun trail on my crosswires somehow. There's the sun itself, which is very nicely done. Minus 144, moving down. So I'm not moving the sun, I'm just moving the trail through, oh, look, minus 101.91. I think I'll accept that, except it's not in the center. If we had a vertical crosswire, we could do this better. I'll take that one. So now we've got this in the right place for that particular azimuth angle. Now we go to the slider and we move it along. I like this bit. We bring the sun down into our crosswires. And I'm getting about 15, I think 1508 was better. You can actually put individual values in here. So it's not perfect, but we're not far off. Somewhere around 15.8, 10. We're quite accurate. So we are actually able to get the same results as Suncalc.
There's another way. If you press the sun on the top right in PeakVisor.
Aha! What happens?
You
it
see the
tells you.
azimuth angle.
Yes.
And then you can just switch the day time.
Yeah.
And get the proper result.
So what did you get?
About the same, 1508.
Yes. The accuracy is never going to be perfect, but that's brilliant. So we now know that it's not just that we've incorporated that functionality, it means that PeakVisor is being developed in a way that if there's some other tool that could be incorporated, then there's a possibility to ask for that. It's extremely useful. I'll show you really why later, because it's not about necessarily entirely chronolocating an image. It's about trying in the first place to find out what a reasonable search area is when you know where the sun is. So you can actually eliminate search areas. That's probably a bigger use of it, to be honest. So we've seen the human eye can't actually determine depth. And the distance of objects isn't obvious to us at all. So there's something that probably you do without knowing in Google Earth. I'm just going to close that poll, which is you trying to get an idea of what the image is really telling you. And it's just a little wiggle, really. It's no big deal. But this is Google Earth because we can move it very quickly, unlike PeakVisor. But if we just move side to side, the minute it starts to move, our brain gets an idea of depth that just isn't there when you look at the still image. You might have some clue, but as soon as it starts to move, you're much more certain. So just have a go at that. You don't have to use my location coordinates if you can find anywhere that's a better example. But just remind yourself how much information you can get from moving ever so slightly, and your brain's comparing those two slightly different views. And I think when you do it, just bear in mind, it's the change in relative positions of the objects in that image. The ones that are close to us, a very slight movement moves them a great deal. The ones far away, it doesn't change much. And it's the change in relative positions, which is how we're able to understand depth at all. And it's what's behind PeakVisor's Photofitting, which is some of the most accurate geolocation tool around. So just give me a shout when you've had a wiggle. You can't wiggle very easily in PeakVisor. It's not smooth, so it redraws everything, so it's slow. But of course, we can use the principle to get ourselves some accurate geolocation. Yes, there is a point where if you click the sun path, it suddenly puts little labels along the sun path that says, well, at 11 o'clock, the sun will be here, and at 12 o'clock, the sun will be here. So I think I'm going to wait until they've stabilized the whole of the sun path stuff and do a little tweet about that. So if everybody's got conversant with the fact that the wiggle really helps, try this. We're looking at a man on a bridge, and he's standing in front of what looks like an office block. He is completely stationary. All that is happening here is that the photographer is changing the focus value. You can look at the focus value in one of two ways. On these images, there is the focal length of the lens displayed. The other way of looking at it is the horizontal field of view. They are inversely proportional. So when the lens is at its longest, the field of view is at its narrowest, and vice versa. And for me, it's almost impossible to believe that he's not moving. His position relative to the bridge is the only thing that makes you think, okay, he never actually gets off the bridge, does he? But his position relative to the background is just mind-blowing to me, that it can look so different, and actually photographer and subject in the foreground are in the same position. And it's almost an illusion relating to depth of field. And it means that even with reference points here, because we do have some reference points, changing this value completely changes your perception of what's going on. And therefore, we might as well be blind in this situation. We need something like PeakVisor to tell us what the true distances are. But watch how they move relative to one another. This is not just zooming. It's not magnifying the image as it would do if you put it into paint. It's adjusted according to depth of field. It's quite a complex thing that's going on. So PeakVisor gives us absolute depth measurement, which means that we now are in a position to use the amazing sensitivity of these images to help us geolocate. So the same principles apply. The image silhouettes that are generated by anything that's doing 3D rendering of terrains, they're hugely sensitive to location. Thank God, that's the thing we really want to change. But they're also hugely sensitive to the horizontal field of view, to the focus. It's not just cameras that have a horizontal field of view. There is an implicit horizontal field of view in the rendered image that both, say, Google and PeakVisor create. So whether you like it or not, there's something in there that may not be at the right value for you to fit your silhouette. You need to be able to change the field of view to get good photo fitting. And the reason Google can't do it is that Google's field of view is fixed at around 60 degrees in Google Earth Pro. So that means that you can do an overlay, but in practice, you can't use it for these purposes. It's only tools like PeakVisor which do this. And this is the thing, you are able to change field of view in Google if you do a tour. That allows you to set field of view, but then you can't do geolocation inside a tour. And you can also do it if you import and export in the KMZ, KML file formats, but it's not something that you can use live, which is what we need. So contours, lines, sight, distance turn out to be something that deceive us. Here's an exercise about all of those things in Ukraine. I was trying to locate this with a friend, and I'll play it to you. It is somebody, I think, driving through a cemetery and trying to demonstrate the extent to which the cemetery has been filled recently with fresh graves. So it's another sad piece of footage. I'll play it a couple of times because it's short, but what we're seeing is the cemetery in the foreground, and then on the horizon, we're seeing things that might give us a clue as to where we are. So we'll watch it a couple of times, and then we'll measure some stuff on Google Earth to give us some clues, but here we go to start with. Does anybody, by the way, know what he's saying? Does anybody speak Ukrainian? I think it's Ukrainian, I'm not sure. So speak up if you do.
We cannot actually hear the video.
Oh,
volume.
can't you? I'm sorry. Oh, I thought you could hear it. It sounds like Zabrowski Miyu. That's it. It's just one sentence he's saying. Okay, I'll play it again. You can see here that we are seeing a skyline. It's got chimneys, not surprising. This is Mariupol, so it's quite an industrialized place. And we're not just seeing chimneys, we're also seeing the shape of buildings. So the chimneys aren't peeking up over something, they're actually next to the rest of the skyline. So I'll play it one more time just so you can check it out again. Here comes the industrial skyline. All right. So we looked at this and we know it's in Mariupol. The central cemetery is Starokrimska. So that was our working hypothesis. There are loads of cemeteries outside of there that are in the area and that are in fields. So that was just where we were starting. And the hypothesis was, well, that's Starokrimska. So the skyline is Azovstal. It's Azovstal because that's the place that's in the news right now, because it's huge. Everybody's heard of it. Therefore, that's Azovstal. Now, one of the problems there was that all the skylines were changing because the place was being bombarded so much. So even if you're going to try to match skylines, it was quite difficult because you'd have to match the pattern of relative elements. That would stay the same, but any single element could be removed. So that was tricky. But what we want to do, very quick and dirty, is to test that hypothesis. If we think this is Starokrimska, fine. If that's Starokrimska, is that Azovstal? If it's not, what do we do? If it is, prove it. If it's not Azovstal, what is it then? So let's first just go into Google Earth and get ourselves the distance between Starokrimska and the Azovstal steel plant. So this exercise is really about being able to use PeakVisor in a very quick, dirty way to eliminate a lot of things. It's nothing to do with precision. It's almost the opposite. And it's a way that you can save yourself a lot of time. So we're only looking for a very approximate measurement. But if you get Google Earth out, I'll say let's use the pools in Starokrimska. There are 3 little pools at the bottom of Starokrimska Cemetery. And the slag heap, the oval one by the sea in Azovstal. So let's have a go and just measure that. Okay, here's Starokrimska. If you zoom in, you can see these little pools at the bottom. And you can also see the sad fact that we were being shown, which is all this fresh earth. And it doesn't look like this now either. The date of this image is 5/9/22, which I think is presented in the American format, isn't it? So here's the area. There's Starokrimska. And I'll just zoom out a little bit so I can fit Azovstal in. Right. Here is Azovstal, the scene of the terrible siege. There's the slag heap, so I'll get my ruler, I'll stick it in the pools, and I'll stick it on the slag heap to show it's about 11 kilometers. When I measured it on the slide, I wasn't using the slag heap, but it's within the order of 10 kilometers away. So that's what we're looking at. If we think we're seeing something 10 kilometers away. So what we want to do is a little exercise using PeakVisor to see whether that could possibly be Azovstal we're looking at, or whether it's something else, and to do it really speedily. So we want to use PeakVisor in the same place. That's what the blue area is Starokrymska. The red one is Azovstal when you're seeing it in the PeakVisor 2D map. So we want to take those and find them and check out the line of sight between Starokrymska and Azovstal steelworks. So you're using shift and left mouse to do the distance. And then you're going to compare your value with the distance you know that Azovstal is from Starokrymska now. We know it's somewhere, depending where you're measuring, it's about 10 kilometers away. So have a go at that. Choose a point as close to the horizon as you can to get the correct distance. Make sure you're pointing in the right direction. So you're going to need to have it very clear in your 2D window that you're pointing in the right direction. You could do lots of stuff about what's the exact compass bearing, but the thing we're trying to do here is just quick and dirty. You can eliminate the whole thing. So just point at it, choose some points on the horizon, tell me what you get. So we're trying to test whether we think it's reasonable we can see Azovstal from Starokrymska. And here I measured it shorter, so it was about 8 kilometers, but we know it's a reasonably long way. If I then go to Starokrymska and orientate myself, I have to pan out a little bit so I can fit Azovstal in as well. And then pan around until I'm pointing at Azovstal. Azovstal's here, it's that sort of bite into the coastline. There's the slag heap, right? So that's pretty much Azovstal. So I'm going to measure to the horizon. Boom. Oh, that's a bit of a surprise. I thought that was miles away, didn't you? 400 meters. I haven't got out of the graveyard. Dismiss that if you don't want any trouble. PeakVisor doesn't like it. Try again. 500 meters. Uh-oh. So what do we think is happening? I'd have to look somewhere way away from Azovstal to be able to see very far. I'm only seeing under 1 kilometer, but actually Azovstal is like 10 kilometers away. So what do we think is going on? Talk to me, guys. What's PeakVisor telling us?
I think that we do not have enough altitude to see something bigger, or maybe there's not something bigger.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. We don't have enough altitude. Yeah, that's a lovely way of putting it. Thank you. We're stuck in a dip, unsurprisingly. And the other way to find this out would be to look at a contour map and see if there's anything higher than Starokrymska in the way. You've also got to allow for the fact that buildings and chimneys get built high. But remember, we can actually see the buildings in this skyline in the video. We're not just looking at a chimney pointing over somewhere. So it's very quick and dirtily telling us that's not in your skyline.
You can also see it if you create a line in Google
yes.
Earth, and then go to draw a line and then go to altitude and put the altitude as the point you're starting at, and then see whether the line gets interrupted by the ground.
Yes, you can see a slice in the earth, and it will show you the profile of the earth as you go. But this is very quick. all you do is land and point. So I find it extremely powerful. There could have been something in the way that's a building that PeakVisor's missed. It would probably miss a chimney, because remember we went to the Tower of London, we realized that something has to fill quite a big 30-meter square for it to register on PeakVisor. But the thing is, with line of sight, if it's a chimney, we can see around it. So the thing to me that makes me think I can eliminate Azovstal is because I can see the buildings on the skyline, not just the chimney. So I would use this to say it's all probabilities, but I would look elsewhere at this point. So somebody's already done that. Now, what do you think to that? Do you think there's another place? Would you look for another place? If you still want to think that this is Starokrymska, you're not going to go looking for graveyards elsewhere. You're seeing something on the skyline that looks like an industrial plant. So the person who actually said, I've gone looking elsewhere, is this what you found when you went to look and said, I found somewhere else?
I think so. Let me just check the 2D map so I'm more accurate. Not quite. I went further than that, but that was the direction, I think.
Okay, so this is another industrial plant with chimneys. It's quite close. It's actually a little bit closer than Azovstal, and it's called something like, please forgive my pronunciation, Kalmiuski. So we can do the same test on Kalmiuski. Is there a line of sight? What do we think? So have a go. You're in the same place. You're still testing Starokrymska. The distance is more like between 5 and 6 kilometers. Go back, point at Kalmiuski, and see if you think that this is more feasible. So this is Kalmiuski. It has an obvious curved railway here. We're still at Starokrymska next to our pond. When you zoom in, you can find features which are definitely chimneys. They're very obvious. And I think the same would show on Google Earth also. So we're going to point at this. I suggest trying to point at the chimneys. So this is Kalmiuski on Google. There's the curve of that railway line being drawn in. We can home in on the chimneys. Look, here they are. One of them, PeakVisor thinks is the same as the other, but in fact, they're looking very different at this point in time, which is 2022. So I don't know, that doesn't look like, maybe it could be damage. I don't know. What does it look like to you? Does it look like damage? Maybe. So we would be looking for those, and we would do it in PeakVisor. So we're going to be pointing about 60 degrees, 62 degrees. And in the same way, we are checking how far away everything is. And you can actually see us hit Kalmiuski when we do it. This is all hitting the industrial area. So what we are seeing is Kalmiuski. That would have been a very quick exercise to do that would have saved you a lot of time. PeakVisor would be very quick on this. So Kalmiuski, obviously you were quite right to say, I'm not basing a geolocation on this. What you would do is probably investigate further and look at the skylines. And in fact, we did match every single little tooth of the skylines, and which worked for Kalmiuski and not for Azovstal. There was one or two things which had been knocked out by the special military operation. So we're starting to look at strategies, and in particular, we seem to be moving away from I'm going to exactly solve this problem in one step to I need a strategy. And what I need to do is eliminate loads of swathes of my search area so that I can actually start to find a search area that's feasible. So the interesting thing is that Gabor published a paper recently called Proving a Negative, which is very much along these lines. Would you just like to say a few words, explain what your paper is about, Gabor? If you just switch your mic on.
Yeah, well, let's see if I manage to explain it properly. So the idea is just that usually you try to find a match as a way to geolocate something, like to prove it's somewhere you photofit a match. But sometimes the problem is that you can't really manage to find one. But for example, there's a claim out there which says this thing happened in this little area. Let's say it happened in a small town in the Amazon. Then sometimes you just don't manage to find a match. But the characteristics in the video are so broad that it could be anywhere else in the entirety of the Amazon. So you can't really expect to quickly find where it was made. What you can do in some cases is, for example, such as in this case, create a 3D model or just a model of the area that they claimed it happened. And then you can have a camera run through there and you can show that there is no match in this area that they claimed it was, then it can't have been there.
Like it. So knowing where you aren't as important as knowing where you are sometimes. And when you have a really tough geolocation, proving the negatives is a really big deal. Thanks, Gabor. I thought that was a really interesting paper. We've put the link in the chat for you as well. So it's a bit like Sherlock Holmes's approach, which is, eliminate everything that's not possible and what's left is true. So here is the equivalent of the open source researcher's Bible. These are the words of Carlos Gonzalez. If you don't know who Carlos Gonzalez is, he is the guy who does the geolocations that no one else can do for Interpol. Naturally, he works for Bellingcat, and he has, he's an engineer, so he has a very process structured approach. And one of the things that he says, apart from have a strategy, which is very important, he says that you need to keep good records of where you aren't. And that's really true. So I've just made this good housekeeping slide to say to you, these are the things that have helped me. One is whenever I'm screenshotting something, leave the address bar in, leave the date in. In PeakVisor, it will tell you everything you need to know in the address bar if your browser shows everything. Also keep a record when you're eliminating search space, all those little jigsaw pieces, tick them off. It's very tedious. When you start, you don't think you're going to need it, but you can spend so much time going back over where you've been. And here is a case of do something that I say, not I do. Keep your Google Earth records nicely filed with all your locations. Mine are a terrible mess and I'm ashamed of it.
Any suggestions on how to do the search elimination space?
Often it can just be a map that you divide into tiles, or you can create tiles within, say, Google Earth and color them in when you've finished, when you've searched an area. That's a possibility. It depends how complex it is. The simpler, the better, really, isn't it? I'm going to show you a case this afternoon, which is quite complex. And we had to do all sorts of different things to try to eliminate search space. So this is our last slide for today before we get some tea, because it's about performance issues. And I think you've learned a lot about performance issues this morning. So the quick fixes are refresh the window. When you need to do something like a teleport, you'll have to refresh the window because PeakVisor needs a little bit of a kick sometimes. Know when to reload PeakVisor from scratch, and sometimes grab your URL, chuck it in another browser and see what that does. PeakVisor is going to get stabler, but it's going to be a slow process. the more you contribute through the POPSI project, the quicker that'll happen. Signs that things aren't going well are when your map pin doesn't move with your panorama, or when your URL doesn't change. That's obvious, and it's true in other tools as well. So the things to watch out for are changing the date and time, teleports, and something we'll see this afternoon, which is called the boomerang effect, when we're trying to move in the 3D space and we lose the patience of the server and we boomerang back and forth a bit. So this is a summary of all the current controls we know about. And it changes. And sometimes the developers don't tell me, and I ask them for something and they go, oh, actually, if you press shift and so, we sort of coded that up before. So that's always fun to find out. But this is always going to be changing. So check on the social media accounts. I've been told to get one on Mastodon, so I'll do that next to see the latest edition. That one's from the 1st of October. So we're no longer talking about PeakVisor, just what it delivers. We're talking about it as one of a set of tools. And we are taking our Tajikistan imagery and looking at how we would start from scratch to take a Carlos Gonzalez strategic approach to solving this from scratch. And it uses most of the things we've covered today. It makes a good case study for the interplay of different open source investigation tools and the case for working with quite carefully with strategies. So if you've been given those two images, one was actually a little video that was joined together. I was very careful to leave the joins to remind myself that I didn't know whether the position of the cameraman had changed very slightly during the videos, so those still images might not have come from the same place, and I didn't know whether the camera had been zoomed either. The other one was a still image in which I had more confidence. So we know at the outset that we're in a place that has less data than usual. It's not your normal full street view. So in Google, if you look here, there aren't that many pieces of information. There are little photos in there, but nothing in the area that we eventually found. So the Google rendered view isn't distinctive. It's smooth when you go into ground level view. So that's not particularly helpful. Little street view photography, it's looking more like a possibly PeakVisor issue. And it's not necessarily that there are mountains, it's what data we don't have from other tools that makes us decide that. And it helps that there's dramatic terrain. The only other bit of data that we could find was on Mapillary. Give me a shout if you use Mapillary. I'd be very interested to know whether you use Mapillary or not.
Yes,
Gabor does, yeah. So for us to try to find anything that was helpful in this region, the fact that one chap did, or chapess, I think it was a man, did this journey with his camera taking images from his car at intervals, allowed us to see one direction at car level of what's going on. We've actually gone past a place which was being built in 2019 when he went by. It has various characteristics that make you think that it might have some sort of military purpose or security purpose. It has high fences, a fuel supply, and security cameras go in there later. So you pick up all sorts of interesting things. This was the scene of a lot of the alleged violence, and it figures in other imagery from the time. But this wasn't going to help us. This guy didn't go to the area that we eventually found. So although he very cleverly picked up, here you can just pick out some white splodges on the mountainside. They are in fact graffiti, which is supporting the Aga Khan, and is therefore put there by a religious and ethnic minority of people. And those are now being erased right now. So it's amazing what you pick up on these things, but it wasn't going to work for us. In the scenery, there are very few scaling features. We're looking at hard rock. We had some people. That was a help there. And there are natural landmarks that we can use for reference. But on the whole, this was a bit of an obvious include PeakVisor in the mix kind of open source project. Back to Carlos, you can tell his style because of his slides. And he's saying, have a strategy, select your toolbox, and do some learning and archiving, eventually move towards verification. And he breaks that down to show you with a strategy and going through a circuit. So we're trying to be methodical about this. What do we know about our example here that could reduce the search space? We have an idea about the time of it. Would that help? Because we have sun and shadow in our imagery. The still image has the very good shadow we've already used. There's the terrain, it's quite characteristic. Could we use the altitude? We can even use the country because we do know that this is in Tajikistan, not across the border. We have a slope of the land that we can see in our images. The people got up there in the sorts of clothes they're wearing. They're not mountaineering. They've climbed hills, but they're not actually mountaineering. So we can eliminate places that may not be a very steep slope, but if there's no way of getting there that isn't relatively easy to climb, then we can probably eliminate that. And we also did get a certain amount of information from a tip-off. I can just see a little question there. Let me see.
Yes. So you mentioned time. So
Yes.
how time is useful for us if we're not sure about the location, the exact location of something?
Just to eliminate, you make an assumption and you eliminate. So we're actually going to do that to show us eliminating some space. But yes, it's a good question. You only have one blank to fill in. You can't fill in all of them. But if you make an assumption and say, well, actually, if the time's this, then the sun should be coming from such and such a place, and it isn't, then I'm going to search everywhere, but the order in which I search will change. I'm trying to think of it as a sort of probability function. Some areas are much more probable than others, just like the game of whether you're warm or cold when you're a child and you're looking to find something and your siblings hidden it and they tell you whether you're warm or cold. Is it probable or not very probable? And so I'm looking at the search space in that way. So yes, you can only use time in that sense until you have more information. So we had a tip-off, which was somebody sent this rather inexact map from the region. So this is local information. And what they said was burial from video here. Now, if you took the area that they've actually written the words on top of, then that's burying someone on top of a mountain. We know we're not on top of a mountain, but I think this is what they were referring to. And they're simply trying to say you are closer to the Batang Valley in this location than you are to Rishon itself, which is here. We always come up with problems where it can be spelt Rishon or Rishan, and that usually slows you down as you do lots of searching. So the tip-off's not hugely detailed, but every extra dimension, whether it's the slope, the border of the country, accessibility, shadow directions, can reduce the search space, makes it more likely you'll get a solution, makes it quicker to deliver. So here is our map of the area. This is what we are going to search. And these are our considerations. So firstly, we use the slope. We pick out from the contours the areas to search which look to have a similar slope to that we can see in the images. So that's quite a lot of valley. We know we're supposed to be near Rochon, but that's about it. And what we mean by near, we don't know. We're eliminating the really high mountains because that's infeasible. But this is still looking like quite a big area. So which of bits of this do you search first? Well, that is the border. So anything which is not in Tajikistan, we will eliminate because we know that it's unlikely that anything like this would cross the border into Afghanistan. So we've said, first of all, we're going to search in Tajikistan with that kind of slope. And then we put in the area from the tip-off indicated on social media. So that makes this area more likely. Of course, it could be anywhere, but probabilistically, it's more likely to be somewhere here. And that local knowledge has, again, reduced our search space. So have a look in PeakVisor. I'm not giving you coordinates. I want you to just land somewhere in PeakVisor to take a look around. You've got two directions you can go. This is the Bartang River Valley down here. This is the Panj River Valley up here. Are you going to prioritize one or the other? Are you going to search half of this first or second? Is there anything you can spot when you land in PeakVisor that would make you choose one or the other? Just have a look. If you'd only just come across this and you were to take a look around, of course, you'd look in Google and see this very smooth terrain that you could move around in. But what would you think if you look at the two of them? And then can you think of any way that we can distinguish between those two different sets of the same search area? Just take a minute to look. That immediately speaks to me as being something that is recognizable. But it's far more likely that I don't see anything of the sort. You could look up here and maybe spot, but that would just be chance. A systematic search using a map where you tick off tiles is probably going to do better. But I'm not sure there's anything, unless you're amazingly lucky and have a fluke, really obvious that'll make you set off in one direction searching than another. But what about if we hypothesize about the sun? Because the difference between these two bits of search area are that one of them, the mountainside, is in one direction and the other's at almost 90 degrees. You've almost gone around the corner. And we also know from the images that we're pointing uphill and the sun is coming from our left. So if I'm going to start searching somewhere, I'm going to work out whether the position of the sun and the time it implies is going to change my mind about where I start searching. So we remember the shadows were almost shining along the mountainside. They were coming from the left. So we can now hypothesize, well, if we're in the Panj River Valley, the sun would be shining in one particular direction, wouldn't it? So it'd be more like this. So I'm going to let you think about what that means in terms of the time of day. If you want to use Suncalc or PeakVisor, to have a little think about, if you're pointing this way, what does that mean about the time? If the sun's coming from over here and you're on this bit of the hill, or if you're this way in the Bartang River Valley, the sun will be coming from a different direction. So I'll put the little poll up just to know when you've finished. I appreciate it's frustrating if you're having issues with performance. I'm wondering if they're also regional to some extent. When you start PeakVisor, you get a different view depending on where you are. So for me, I start with Ben Nevis at the moment, and other people in other places start with other ones. So it may be that performance is also regional. I'm not sure. We should check that out. I'm very interested in anything we can feedback about performance to the developers. So that poll should now be launched. You should see a couple of questions just to make you think about whether we can reduce search space by thinking about the sun, the shadows, the time. And so this is going to hinge around if the time of the burial is feasible for what those shadows tell us about the time of day. Okay, so let's take a little look at this. It doesn't really matter which tool we use, but if we are on this mountainside in the Panj River Valley, then our azimuth angle is about 290. And that means that approximately when you go to Suncalc, the time turns out to be about 7:20. And this is a place where you need to check Suncalc, not PeakVisor, or at least to look at the tab information in PeakVisor as well, because 1920 is very close to dusk. And so if the image was taken in the Panj Valley on that date, it's likely to have been taken near dusk. Do you think it looks like dusk from the images? And that's really where this piece of logic comes from. It comes from, okay, it could be dusk. It doesn't look it, but let's at least allow that information, given that we know that if we're in the Batang River Valley, it's going to be more like mid-afternoon. We already did that. Then it's more likely to be mid-afternoon. So start searching there. So again, this is another quick and dirty thing, which is allowing us to cut down our search space. So we already did this bit. This was the Batang River Valley. We know what happens here. And so we're more likely to say that that's where we'll start. But however much you cut down your search space, sooner or later, you're going to have to do the legwork. Search is about sitting there and doing the work. So we would employ what I would call a frog-like approach, hop and pan, hop and pan. We know that we're searching for a view uphill, so we follow the contours to look uphill. We don't have to pan 360 degrees. We can pan about 180 degrees around the direction of the arrow. And we choose our search steps as something where it's big enough that the view has changed sufficiently to merit searching. So this is how you would go about it. Now, when I actually did this work, PeakVisor didn't move dynamically very easily. So I was literally choosing points up here and ticking them off. I was not able to move smoothly. You only really need that very delicate change of latitude and longitude when you're homing in on something. So now we have a little more choice, but in the end, you're still going to choose quite big steps. Otherwise, you'll never finish. So we might also just try to orientate ourselves about, are we at the right distance from various landmarks? Does it make sense that we are searching this area? So for confidence, really, we can choose obvious landmarks and work out some distances and check whether that's sensible. So an obvious one is to choose, say, from the Snaggletooth Rock over to the biggest labeled mountain, which is either labeled Khanum, 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 or Hanim, Hanim, depending on what humor PeakVisor and Google are in. But I will give you a little time to do the exercise to measure the distance between the Snaggletooth Rock that we used as our due north and the nearest big labeled mountain that appears on everybody's radar, which is Hanum. So just try with both tools to see if you can do Snaggletooth Rock to Hanum. So the point of this really is to say that our difficulty is that we can see the right mountains on here. Google Earth knows where they are. But what we can't do in Google Earth is to pick up the other end of that distance, which is we can go close to where we think the viewpoint is, but we can't actually find the Snaggletooth Rock's location because we can't see it in any view. Even if we go to ground level view, we will see something that's too smoothed. And that is a difficulty for us trying to manipulate these kinds of terrains with Google Earth. But PeakVisor can actually take you up there. You point at the Snaggletooth Rock, you teleport there, and then you can look over at the mountain it's labeled and do the distance. So my values were not the same. I had a probably 30% difference, which means that I wouldn't have been able to confirm my location that easily just by looking at parallel reference points. But in the end, when we have these two images and we're hunting for a match, which one would you use if you're trying to do a photo fit? If you think you've got close and you want to do a photo fit, which one would you use and why? You're looking to do a photo fit match. Would you use the video composite or would you use the still image? The photo fit's going to depend on being at the correct field of view and taken from the same place.
Well, I would go for the photo because you don't get any like shifts from perspective and so on.
Exactly. When you're working with these, do you often make composites of stills from a video? Is that something you're used to doing?
Sometimes, but not regularly. I usually just use like pause videos or like do stills from videos.
I've ended up doing quite a lot of them. It's possible to almost trick yourself by covering up the joins quite well, but they exist in terms of the fact that the camera may have shifted zoom and the camera person may have moved. So in that sense, I think it's better. Say we were doing a photo fit, all we'd got was the video composite. If there are some snags where it doesn't fit very well, I would expect them, if it is the right location, to be at the joins in the video stills. So you're absolutely right. We would choose the still image for sure. So let's have a go at this. I will send you the image and we can try doing a photo fit. This is the nearest PeakVisor rendition. That's the video. That's the still. Let's have a go. See if you can pull that into PeakVisor around these coordinates and get a very good photo fit match. You'll be changing lots and lots of different features. Give you a few minutes just to see how far you can get, and I'll do it alongside you. I'm going to switch the lights on just because it's prettier by making the time 11:50. Now I'm pressing my import photo button. I'm going through all these pretty screens. And at the last minute, it says to you, is this where you wanted? And you feel like saying, well, yeah, that's why I put PeakVisor there in the first place. But I'm sure it's good it checks. Now I've got my overlay. I'm going to recolor it because it's not so easy to see. Here it is in red. Okay. I can alter the angle. That's rotation, as opposed to pitch and yaw, or it's called roll if you're someone who is into video games and maybe flying, or in fact a submarine pilot. When you use mouse scroll wheel to change horizontal field of view, then you are actually changing in steps of about 6 or 7 degrees. When you use shift and plus and minus, then you're moving in steps of probably 1 degree. I'm looking to the edges of this image in particular and trying to make sure that it still fits at the edges. It's a lot easier to fit the center than the edges. You have to be very honest with yourself when you're doing this. Of course, the really interesting thing about the Photofit is to shift your location very slightly and see how sensitive that Photofit is to location. It may seem fiddly and detailed, but it's also the thing that it serves as serious confirmation for a geolocation. But say we've even got to this stage. We've got to the stage where we think that we found it. And this happened to me, and I wasn't sure. I just thought it looked like a good fit. So I asked the Bellingcat people who were staff, who were working on the global authentication program, and they didn't go yes or no, because that's not how Bellingcat worked. They said, right, we'll check it. So Bellingcat doesn't just take even a very good Photofit like this for granted. What happens is it goes for confirmation elsewhere. So you try some other tools on it. So to my great excitement, what Bellingcat did, I thought at first they were actually tasking a satellite, but they didn't need to do that because this is in the past. What they did was to go, because they have access to planet data, they could look at and compare satellite images taken in the past on either side of the date we're talking about. So they had an image for May 18th and they had an image for May 25th. And one of the difficulties for me was that I sat there terribly excited with somebody explaining to me and showing me the planet imagery and the fact that they could see a very specific change in the terrain very near where PeakVisor had located the imagery. But unfortunately, with satellite imagery, my screen over Discord wasn't good enough really to see the difference. It's extremely hard to make out. But trust me that under this green area here, there is a discolored piece of Earth. And that was the next hypothesis, that because the discoloration appeared just after May 18th and disappeared, it appeared just after May 17th, which was when the events happened, and then it disappeared again within about a week. The working hypothesis was that this was the Earth that had been displaced partially by the burial, but also by that crowd of people we saw. So going to another tool to check things, obviously, if this was current, we could ask to have a satellite tasked onto a particular area in the current time. And I've done that with some of the graffiti in Tajikistan. There are reports that it's being removed by the authorities where it has an ethnic connection, excuse me, ethnic or religious connection. And so we need to see what the state of it is now. So then we would be tasking a satellite. This is just looking back through the imagery. We also use this for work on the ships in Sebastopol, looking at whether grain was being stolen or not, or at least how much grain was being stolen hand over fist. And you hope that the imagery that comes back is good enough resolution and doesn't have clouds in the way. Is anybody here in the habit of working with a lot of satellite data or tasking satellites? I'd be interested to know. Talk to me if you do.
I mean, I don't really task them that many, but I try to find or just ask, for example, for planet data sometimes in case of things in Gaza or the Middle East where you just want more updated photo imagery. And I just check that way. Because, for example, if a house got demolished, it's easier to check on updated imagery, but then not specifically tasking, but more similar to how Bellingcat does it.
On Discord, we see a lot of requests going through for data on Ukraine, and it's what Gabor's describing, which is houses and buildings and whether they're still there the next day when there's been a raid. You often need money to subscribe to these services, so individuals usually have to ask somebody else, as Gabor does and as I do, because volunteers don't have access to Planet through Bellingcat, but you can ask nicely. So this was relatively confirmed. And the next thing that happened in Bellingcat was it went to an editor to write about it as an investigation. And that raised a whole new level of challenge. So the editor said, okay, that looks promising, but what if I need to look at other satellite images and compare them, because I want to know whether actually sheep regularly kick up this ground, or, you know, some other feature that these little speckles that appear and disappear happen regularly. So we had to satisfy him with that. No, this is quite unusual and just in this place. Okay, he says, well, what about we measure the area? We know the scale of the satellite. What's the size of the area? And I had to go back and say, well, I can tell you what the size of the area is, but this is displaced Earth by a crowd of people. It's not the actual grave site. So we can't say there were 5 bodies and therefore it's about the size of that. We can't really use that. So he said, all right then. But he still wasn't totally convinced. And that's nothing but a good thing. You so want your geolocations to be correct, and yet the risk of getting one wrong and publishing it causes far more harm than getting one right. The world will live without your amazing geolocation, but you might actually damage someone or some institution you admire if you put something forward that isn't really tested. So the objection that he did have was that this displaced Earth is very close to the area that Photofitted in PeakVisor, but it's not identically over the spot. There is an error. It's only about, when you calculate it, about 170 meters, but it's an error. So what we did was to put the new location from the satellite back into PeakVisor to try those new coordinates and to look to see whether the goodness of fit had changed. Now you're looking at 2 pretty good likenesses to the photograph, but one of them is slightly better than the other. And that's because of some of the proportions in the image. So if we call this big bit down here the elephant's trunk, if you look at it, its width relative to the rest of the image, this is too wide. That's the location that seemed to fit quite well. It's just a bit too wide. If you look at where the slope cuts the entire image, this is a bit too low down. if you look at how much of the rest of this line you can see past the Snaggletooth before you hit the Teapot Mountain, there's a bit too much here. When you look at this one, which is the satellite location view, it's closer. Now, one of the things that we need, lots of people look at PeakVisor and say, oh, we need to automate the whole thing. And yes, that would be marvelous. We need to automate the way that the Photofit matches. But before that, we need some sort of measure of the goodness of fit of a Photofit image. Some way of saying to what extent it deviates from the silhouettes in the photograph. So that would be the basis for any automation of this process. And at the moment, it's down to the good old human eye. But if you examine the proportions of this image and these two rendered views, then actually the satellite location is a slightly truer image. These are only 170 meters apart. And yet, when you look closely, there is a difference. So there's where we started out. That's what we found on PeakVisor. This new red dot, 176 meters away, that is what we found on the satellite. Logic would probably dictate that the satellite would be more accurate, but we still want to think about what's happening in PeakVisor between those two different assessments. And we tried to think about how to deal with that and what would make the most sense. And we decided that we should actually, okay, we thought that satellite was better fitted than the PeakVisor original location. But if that was the case, then we actually ought to see the whole thing smoothly move into focus as we move from one to the other. And it should be that if you plop down and give PeakVisor a location somewhere randomly selected, it doesn't look just as good. There's the horror that nearly everywhere on the whole plain, the whole river valley looks a bit like that, quite close. So we wanted to test that. And what we did was simply use trigonometry to work out what angle do we want to move along in PeakVisor in a straight line using the new shift and arrows technology to move smoothly from one to the other and watch the view. We didn't just have to look at the endpoints. We could work out the coordinates of the straight path. And what we hope is that it's not a fluke and this thing just gradually comes into better focus as a likeness to the original photo. So we actually did that. This is a video of that transition. So here is the area of the Bartang Valley. This is the little road, the Bartang Valley Road, that we get to recognize. The mountains are here. This is our PeakVisor guess. And this is the satellite one that we're thinking of replacing it with because we think it's more accurate. We're going to move those 176 meters along here and see what happens to the image. Does it really just improve? Or is it some random fluke? And then when we've got there, we'll set off into the mountainside to see how does the view change. We'd like it to be very different. If it's quite similar, then that's going to make it all look a bit random. So here goes with the video, starting from the photo match we found with PeakVisor. Oh, no, it doesn't. Cow. Trying again. I think I put that a bit low down to press. No, here we go. So because it's a video, I can show you what I was actually touching on the keyboard. Shift and left. I've angled myself at the right compass bearing, and we're moving along that path. We're seeing all the intermediate PeakVisor fits. And so far, it's very smooth. You can watch it changing. Nothing too bad's happening. So now we're getting to the satellite confirmed location. PeakVisor obviously is trying to catch up. right? That looks familiar. That's the one with the right elephant's trunk, and it looks okay. So that to us is some sort of security that this isn't random. And now we're heading off past the good photo fit, past the satellite image, to a random endpoint to see what happens. PeakVisor again is taking some time to catch up. Ooh, I think we've frozen. I wonder what did that. Yeah, now we're moving again. That wasn't PeakVisor, that was the video. And now it redraws. It's not similar. We are looking at a completely obscured view. So the whole valley doesn't look like that picture slightly changed. Actually, it's very specific whether or not you have the view that we saw in those images. It doesn't exist from very many places. So this is good confirmation that we found a good place with PeakVisor, we improved it with satellite, and we've put that back into PeakVisor to examine it and see that we think it's still a good photo fit. You can check out what's happening to your viewpoint by stepping away from the point you're standing on, taking a vantage point somewhere else with a line of sight, and seeing what you were standing on. Because if you're standing on something that's very uneven ground, as you move, you'll get really big variations in your rendered 3D panorama. If you're on solid ground and nothing changes much, then it'll be fine. But here, if we step back from what we were actually looking at, the X is marking the approximate location that we were looking at for the satellite disturbed Earth. We can see what probably happened. Over in the right of the image are the things that we can see, like the mountaintop with a teapot lid and the snaggletooth rock. You can see that this ridge would eventually come in the way. And that's what happened. That's what we saw in the video. Similarly, over here, you could have fallen down a hole. Suddenly, you'd been looking up at nothing. That's effectively what happened to us when we went off past the satellite imagery point. So yesterday, we had an interesting case where we were looking at Ben Nevis. And it was a very puzzling exercise at the start because we couldn't see anything at all because we were actually inside a bit of a crater. And as soon as we didn't have to change anything except our altitude, because what we were modeling was actually from a drone footage. If we had been able to look at what we were standing on, just come back and seen this giant crater in the top of Ben Nevis, we'd have understood better. So PeakVisor can quickly give you a good impression of why your viewpoint is changing if you do what we just did and move across a surface over time. So think about the process we've just gone through. It wasn't PeakVisor on its own for a moment. It was Google Earth to start with. It nearly always will be. Then we cut down the search space with Suncalc. Then we did some searching with PeakVisor. Then we found a photo match. Then we went to satellite imagery and found something slightly better that we'd never have found without the PeakVisor fit in the first place. Plugged it back in, and then we tested that in PeakVisor to see if it made sense in terms of the viewpoint. So we've moved from one tool to something that's part of a toolbox and uses a strategy. And that probably is the way forward for more complex geolocations. So PeakVisor, as we know, is a work in progress. We're discussing about how the more people feed into it, the more likely it is to progress. So far, in the first year of the POPSI project, we have delivered the color contrast lines so we can see our photo fits better. We've persuaded the developers to actually make the viewpoint dynamic and changeable It's not as fast as we'd like, but it is very accurate. We now have incremental adjustment of the field of view. We've got sun and moon trails with the adjustable date. We have the crosswire accuracy when we're not giving webinars, because it'll probably come back on Monday. There are user accounts and very simple location storage, not as good as Google, but enough for you to save a location against your name. So I recommend you take an account out just for that facility. But one of the nice things is that PeakVisor is being developed over in the smartphone side of things. And although that's not what we're after, and although a lot of that functionality doesn't affect what we need at all, sometimes it does. So this is an example of a bit of functionality that we've got for free within PeakVisor, which is just on its way to delivery, which is some people like to ski off-piste, and PeakVisor stores, the smartphone one stores their ski trails. And they want to be able to let you know what you would see, as well as what you will feel as you hurtle downhill if you follow these trails. And that's a marvelous thing. And they're going to get the 3D view to change in ways that mimic what it would be like to go down that ski trail. That's great. Do you remember being in the cemetery at Stara Krimska? We were working with a moving vehicle, a moving camera. It would have been incredibly difficult to do much with that imagery, because you can't build the composites, because your viewpoint has changed so much every time. But if we can piggyback this development, then we will actually be on the way to modeling moving cameras, which actually happens more than you think. If people are taking covert photography because they're in a situation where they're threatened, then very often they'll do so from a car. A lot of the Tajik imagery we had was from moving cars. So sometimes you happily get something for free, which is always a good feeling. So the things that are in the pipeline now are goodness of fit for the Photofit, some sort of measure that says how good a fit it is. The path elevation plots, where you can, we were talking about this, already exists in Google, where you can choose a line and look at the plot. Importing and exporting KMZ, KML files. The moving viewpoint modeling. Photo fitting by looking at the cross points where depth changes, and location and path storage, as we have, in my case, in a very big mess in Google Earth. And of course, what would be lovely would be user collaboration for shared maps. But in the end, we're going to get what you ask for. Open source researchers are now invited to contribute what they would like to see as the development directions for PeakVisor, and people are already doing so. So Gabor has submitted a request which has actually been accepted to create an API that will allow you to have the elevation data from PeakVisor to use for other purposes in other apps. And that could be tremendously valuable. So if you're going to take part in the POPSI project, follow the feed. I'll put it on Mastodon as well as soon as I get the hang of that. Use PeakVisor. It should behave better when we're not all using it at once, but also we will see it go up and down in terms of its performance as it's developed. Read the other users' functionality requests like Gabor's. Write your own. And be brave and put it on the tweets. When we put out a tweet asking for new ideas, it's no hassle at all. Put it in. We'll see what the developers say. They won't do everything, but it's a very interesting experiment to have a tool that actually responds to the users in this way. It doesn't happen very often. So if you're trying to get the most out of PeakVisor, then use it with a strategy. Use it with other tools. Keep the keyboard shortcuts to hand. Look at all the updates as they appear on social media. Sign up to account. You can use validated test photos. to practice the Photofits, because you need something where you actually know where it is and you can teach yourself how to do the photo fitting before you actually try to locate places you don't know where they are. And contribute to the POPSI project, actually send something that says, I'd like it to do this, that, and the other. It doesn't have to be huge. Small ones would be equally welcome. And I can't keep track of it all, but the way that you use it will be different from the way I use it. Whenever we feedback with an issue, then we're helping this. So I think keeping in touch is one of the biggest things.